Hi, I'm Sandy Lowres, the Good Girl Confessional podcast and Women Beyond 40 platform would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which this podcast is recorded, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge this land was never ceded. Hello, welcome back to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. Gee, it's really good to be here. I'm your host, Sandy Lowres, and it's so nice to be back in the recording studio bringing you the hard-won wisdom of some amazing women. How would you feel if who you really thought you were and what you built your identity around turned out to be not 100% true? Well, this is exactly the life story of my next guest. Michelle Scheibner has written an amazing memoir called Hush. It is powerful and moving. It is very layered. It is a story about identity, DNA, and a journey of family secret and lies that started to unravel. It's quite the journey. Please welcome to the podcast the amazing Michelle Scheibner.
Hey, how about a podcast about all the music that got us hooked up, knocked up and broken up? If that got you humming a hit from the 70s and 80s, then have we got a show for you. I'm Jo Pybus, and when Sandy's not in the confessional talking to awesome chicks, she's driving a Sandman over to my place and co-hosting Alex the Seal with me and Molly, a podcast about music nostalgia. Just search for Alex the Seal on your podcast app.
Hello, Michelle, and welcome to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. I am so excited to meet you here today.
Oh, and hello, Sandy, and I'm pretty excited to be here, I have to say. I'm not sure that I'm a good girl, but I'm really happy to be talking to you today, yeah.
Oh, I'm thrilled too, and I think what's really lovely about that is our listeners will know that the good girl is actually a bit of a tongue-in-cheek reference to how women should be well-behaved, but quite often, we're not, and I like it.
That's great. I'm loving it.
First of all, I want to say a huge congratulations on your extraordinary memoir, which I have read, which is called Hush, a memoir unraveling the unintended legacy of family secrets. Hush, how extraordinary. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Look, it's been a bit of a journey. It's been, what you read was the third complete manuscript. So I'd done a fair bit of work to try and get the vehicle for the story right.
Yeah.
And the first two, I think I'm kind of really happy with this version because it really is doing what my goal was to do, which is to just put it out there. In a way that invites other people to consider telling their own stories or looking deeper, perhaps looking beneath the facts and figures of their story. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you enjoyed
I
it.
I did. I found it really emotional, powerful, and it was really beautiful for you to take us on that journey with you from grief and angst and a lot of emotion to a pathway to healing, really, which is extraordinary. I think, first of all, we should probably tell our listeners today, for those that don't know, give us a little summary about Hush, and then also what was the turning point for you to decide, I'm going to write this down, I'm actually going to put out a memoir?
Well, it didn't start with the working title of Hush. The working title originally was Who Am I? Because that kind of seemed to sum up everything that I was doing at the time, was just trying to really understand who I was. I'd been sad since the day I was born, really. I was raised an only child. Unbeknownst to me, there was a brother alive, but I didn't know that. I'd been told he'd died soon after birth. And then I came along. So in a sense, I was a replacement baby, really, because I was born, very quickly after him. And my parents, that was the first secret. So Hush is about secrets and family secrets. And some of those secrets we inherit. And some of them are created in our lifetime or our parents' lifetime, and for good intentions, the full information is not shared. And I think that probably happens in many, many families. The second secret was that not only had he not died, but he continued to live. And I didn't know that until I was about 17. Well, no, when I was 17, I discovered that he had been born a Down syndrome baby. And in those days, the medicos advised parents to put your child in an institution where they can have really good care. They're not going to live very long anyway. He was profoundly Downs, was what I was told at 17. Therefore, unlikely he'd live past the age of 7. So he was made a ward of the state because that's what they did. And you go home and get on with your lives. Then when I was, and my parents didn't share any more information, so I didn't know what to do with that. I was heading off to university. Now, I hadn't actually been an only child, but I'd been raised an only child. My identity had been you're an only child of older parents, because that's a whole other part of the story as to why they were older. And I didn't really know what to do with that, because again, one of the stories of the day was, oh, you know what, only children, they're spoilt, they don't learn how to share, it's all about them. And that hadn't been my experience at all. It had not been all about me at all. And so in part 1 of Hush, it's called Family Secrets, and it's kind of the setup, because it then takes you, as I discover one of the other secrets about my father's cultural identity. Again, it had not been shared with me at any time during his lifetime, nor by my mother after he died. And that was a pretty harrowing uncovering. And I tell you what, it is interesting, Sandy, is that memory is a really interesting thing, in the sense that I knew my father had Jewish family, but he said he was Lutheran. His parents were Lutheran. So, again, he must have been Lutheran. And so what did that have to do with anything? I couldn't understand it, but I'd been trained not to ask questions, because the only way you can keep secrets is to not have to answer questions. So part of my identity, I was realising by the time I was at university and then going to work, was that I'd become an expert at answering a question with a question. I'd become an expert at deflection, because A, I didn't really have much to say, but B, I didn't know much. And then as I became more isolated, and in the book we talk about how I do that and why I do that, then I guess my parents' shame, I was actually living my own version of that. And again, that required me to keep secrets. So we had the inherited secret. We had the secret of the generation that I kind of knew but didn't know the details of. And then we had the secrets that I was keeping from myself, and I was now actively keeping from others. And I think it was the shame of all of those other decisions made before me that when I was asked, oh, so you're married? I was a teacher, right? I was a teacher in a secondary school. That was my first career. Parents want to know, oh, are you married? Do you have children? Kids in classrooms want to know, do you have kids, miss? And for me, there was a shame about all. I found it a very difficult couple of questions to answer. And then I found myself in a kind of one toxic relationship after another, where commitment wasn't going to ever be a thing for me, it appeared. And that perpetrated this thing about me. Because if you're not married, why not? What's wrong with you? So I wore that. I wore that as not, I wasn't enough. And I would actually say, to my girlfriends or whoever would listen, why aren't I enough for anybody? So then in part 2 of Hush, we start to see the transition. Because the other thing that was rolling along in parallel, I was kind of in this, parallel existence, was a search for information. I started messing around with astrology when I was in university. I had a friend, let's go and learn astrology. Oh, okay. Cast a horoscope, try and understand what was going on in my life from that. That didn't work. Tried counselling, got a prescription for anti-anxiety pills, and that's about it. That didn't work. Studied philosophy of religion at university, which I think is kind of interesting, Hinduism and Islam. I don't know why I did that, but I did and loved it.
Again, possibly a search for self, search for meaning.
Absolutely, I think so. Didn't know it at the time, but now I think you're right. And again, that didn't hit me until I started reading Hush and joining some other dots. That's kind of funny, isn't it? Because there are many layers to who we are, I think. And then in the third part of Hush, it's really, I found a sense of belonging when I really started getting into the research. So at the start of COVID, I was still dealing with the grief, I think. I thought I dealt with it, but I hadn't. Dealt with the grief of losing someone very close to me who got me. Like, he really got me. And he was curious, and he'd introduced me to some other thinking. And I started to see that maybe theories around abandonment, theories around emotional deprivation were things that were playing out in my life. And again, I was perpetuating it. I was continuing to put myself in situations that repeated the pattern of being abandoned out of relationships and feeling emotionally deprived. I think in retrospect, as an only child with adult parents, spending a lot of time with adult parents, of course they were adults, but with the older parents spending a lot of time with adults, not a lot of time with other kids in my age, I didn't learn to advocate for myself. I didn't learn to argue about who's going first or who's sitting in the front seat of the car or any of those things. When I was much, much older, this is kind of funny, not in the book, it's just an aside. I went on a first or second date with a new beau, and his daughter came along and sat in the front seat. And I just very compliantly sat in the back seat, listened to their conversation. Gee, I didn't know how to. Yeah, I know. Pretty interesting, isn't it? But I did not know how to express my needs in friendships or relationships, or as it turned out, really in the workplace. People would argue that because I did learn to adopt a very schmick, professional, personal brand. I didn't call it a personal brand then, of course. I just knew that I needed to show up and have the focus on my work rather than on who I was personally. That was a better deflection.
I found that fascinating, actually, when reading Hush, that you talk about that. You talk about how you very cleverly, and we all have survival mechanisms, and I'm convinced of that, but yours seemed to be very much that you could separate the personal from the professional, and in actual fact put this professional mask on, if you like, or adopt the professional persona in a way that's who people assumed you were. And in a way, because you just talked about becoming an expert at deflection, and in a way that was one of the ways in which you deflected, because if you're very professional and confident and you know what you're saying and talking about, people are less likely to ask questions, right, to scratch the surface.
They wouldn't dare. I think, people would say I was, maybe when they met me, they found me intimidating. No, I was taller than other people, I suppose. I always wore a heel. I always wore it, even in my teaching days. I pretty much always wore a jacket. Kind of knew instinctively how to elevate the image of myself into that professional zone that was like, don't ask me unless it's about work. Happy to talk to you about that. And then more latterly, I've been in my coaching practice now 20 years. A lot of executive clients. I'd be interested, actually, I know some of them have read Hush, and I'd be really interested to know what they think now about what they thought then. Because people just didn't know. They just didn't quite know. Because I could deflect. How was your weekend? Great. How was yours? Let's talk about yours.
Right. And I think it's really interesting. And, I over the years have done a lot of work on myself, and my listeners are no stranger to this, but, grew up in a not so idyllic childhood, experienced trauma, things happened, and did a lot of work so that I can talk about that, and so that I can talk about it in a way that is not emotive anymore, and that it's part of who I am, rather than, it doesn't define me. It's just a part of my history and who I am. But I find your book fascinating in that way as well. You talk about some really powerful themes, and one of which, of course, is generational trauma. And I was really fascinated because the history of your family was so powerful, extraordinary, and one that wasn't shared with you. And that, tell us about that, and about what you call, you pretty much put on your detective hat, and and started to search for answers to questions that your parents could no longer answer because they were no longer with you. And and everything from your brother, Grant is his name, all the way through to their family history, and the history then of not just your parents but your grandparents. And how did that
my
relate?
great-grandparents, as
right?
It turned out.
Yes, and your great-grandparents, and how that related to you, and this never-ending, suitcase, I guess, that got handed down. And when I say suitcases of emotions and trauma, and that got handed down from generation to generation to generation. Tell us about that.
And, oh, gosh, where to start? Well, I have to say, if it hadn't been for the beautiful and wonderful Sarah, who was the psychotherapist I was seeing at the time, I might have not done it, but she introduced me to the notion that, well, in fact, she identified straight away that the grief that I seemed to be expressing to her had so many layers, and she called it systemic grief. In other words, it was within the family system. And a family system, like any system, for it to work best, all the parts need to be working well. And they all need to be there. You can't have a missing part unacknowledged, because then the system doesn't work. So the grief that I'd felt since a child, and I didn't really experience the trauma in my childhood that you might expect in order to be able to tell a story like this. I think for many readers, the thing is, I thought my childhood was pretty normal. I didn't think there was anything untoward about it. I was well cared for, in the sense that I had all my needs. My parents loved me. They just didn't know how to love fully. But so I think the first level of grief for me was really identifying what it was like for my mother when she was carrying me. So her pregnancy, so soon after having given birth to Grant, profoundly Down syndrome, giving him away. So two things there, never talking about it, well, not to me, and at the same time looking after her aunt who lived in the house with us, who was also disabled and unable to care for herself. And to this day, I don't know what it was, but in my head, it had to be linked to Grant. So by the time I was in my childbearing years and had learned he was Downs, I considered Daphne must have been. That made sense. There was no other explanation. She died when I was 7, in the bathroom next to my bedroom where I was, so that was all. So my mother was looking after Daphne and also looking after my father. Well, not looking after my father, but living with a man who had spent a couple of years in an internment camp in Australia, having escaped Germany at the start of the war, bullied in that camp, probably brutally, I suspect, looking at some of the documentation. So he, knowing also that his parents were still in Germany, and this is the confusing part, as Lutheran you would think they would have been fine. But, they wouldn't have been subject to what went on as part of the genocide of the Holocaust. However, as you know, I eventually went to the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. I knew my father had been born in Berlin, and I found them in the Book of Memory, and I found the date where they were both transported to a death camp, my grandparents. Now, I don't know if my father knew that at the time I was a young child, but I'm pretty sure. And in fact, there is some documentation that suggests he did know as I was growing up. Never, ever, ever spoken of. I spoke to somebody recently who had been part of the family, extended family back then. Hadn't spoken to her for 40 years, older than me. She remembers my dad in tears, and she would say to him, she was a nurse, what's going on for you? And he said, every time I look at Michelle, all I see is my mother. And I'd heard that as a kid growing up. I had an affinity to this woman who I never met, who lived in this teeny tiny photo, one photo only. Because there was something about her that I felt connected to. And then there's some other patterns there that go on. So I think his grief for not only what he'd physically experienced, but because they had converted him to Protestant when he was a child, both his parents his mother had to convert in order to marry his father. So she converted at the age of 23, leaving her family behind to move to Poland. Oh, yes. And moving away from them, hiding her faith in another war zone where they were at the time when my father was a young boy. So going back to this systemic grief, he'd learnt it from a child to hide his Jewish faith. His mother had learnt it. The whole family had become experts at it. So he was hiding that. Then we're hiding the story about Grant. And then the final piece, which comes very late in the book, is these other two siblings of my grandmother who were left behind in New Zealand when my great-grandmother came to Australia. Who were they? Why were they left behind? Out of the family tree, if you like, out of the family system. It's like these missing boys. Grant was a missing boy. William and Reuben were missing boys. So one of the dots I joined, Sandy, is this subconsciously, all of this inherited cortisol soup was going on, if you like.
Yeah.
And in some part of my mind, in some part of my soul, I had decided not to have children. I did not ever consciously make that decision, but I put myself in a place in life that meant it wasn't going to happen. When I started training in the theory of inherited family trauma, and it became, I learnt about some of the themes that we can play out in our lives completely unknowingly. One of them is an identification with another member of the family and with his situation or their situation. And I firmly believe now that in some way I've identified with my brother, who, for your listeners, just by the way, unless they want to read the book, you can cut this out later, but he outlived both his parents. He lived to be 62. He died before his 63rd birthday. He died at the same age my father died. We look for these repeated patterns when we're joining the dots. Now, some people might be listening to this and thinking, oh, gee, that's a stretch. You know, you've identified with someone that you never met and you didn't know. But let me tell you, I know it. I feel it. And so as a very mature adult, I think it's the last thing I say in my TED talk, which is about identity labels and do we need them to be validated. I kind of used to believe we did. I didn't have the right ones. But now I know I am enough. The fact that I didn't do what was expected, married, find a partner, have kids, be a family person, have a career over here, I didn't do that, but I'm still enough.
You are. You are enough. And I love it. Such a powerful thing to say out loud, though, isn't it?
Oh, my goodness, yes. I love being able to say it now. And I believe it. Like my whole energy's changed in the last 3 or 4 years doing this work. I find I think really publishing Hush on Mother's Day, dedicating it to my mother, honouring those missing family members, honouring my father's faith, part of my cultural heritage, that as that kind of, the physical decision to publish that and do it on Mother's Day so that, I don't know, that's like the honouring of all of those players. I don't blame them. I don't, this is not about blame. This is about resolution and honouring. They did the very best they could. They did what they thought was right because it didn't start with me and it certainly didn't start with them. It started before that and before that. That's the huge learning out of all of this. Thank you, Mark Wallen. It didn't start with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really, so me reading your book, it was really fascinating that you draw on all of these amazing references, books that you read, and you have now introduced me to a number of amazing people, and you can't help but go, I'm very much like you. In the book, you say at one point, you really wanted to read this book, but the shop was shut. The bookshop wasn't open yet. So you ran home and you Googled it, and then you fell down a rabbit hole and you listened to interviews. I'm very much like that. So I kind of think I loved that and it resonated with me. But you introduced me to a number of references, books now that I want to go and read. And I think that that's quite beautiful. And I love that you're so generous in that with your readers to say, I found this and then that led me to find this and these are the reasons why it resonated for you. Because I think in reading that you go, oh, actually, that's going to resonate with me too. I feel it. I just know that's what I need to be reading.
Yes.
And you talk about like Dani Shapiro and her podcast was another one. And I think that that's really interesting because her podcast really is about secrets.
It's called Family Secrets.
Right.
And it is about
all
secrets.
About family secrets.
And shout out to Dani Shapiro. I've tried twice to get on her podcast.
Well, big shout out to Dani Shapiro. I would love to have her on my podcast too.
I bet.
But she has this extraordinary podcast for those that don't know. I mean, many people will have heard of her, but, she has, I don't know, something along the lines of 25 million downloads or people listening to her. It's quite extraordinary. And I think, and you so rightly say in your book when you mention her, it's not surprising that her podcast has been shared by so many people and is listened to by millions and millions and millions of people because, and this is a fascinating theme in your book, that I believe that there are secrets and lies in all families. It's just to what degree. How big are the secrets? How big are the lies? How long have they been kept?
Exactly. Absolutely there are. And I think what I really like about Galit Atlas, who I also talk about in the book, who's a psychotherapist, is that she talks about the different types of secrets. And I love that. Look, there's two things from what you just said, Sandy. The first thing, can I just go back to when I was doing all of that reading, and I was reading, like in Mark's book, everything he says, he then follows up with a case study. Now, but it's often just a paragraph. Sometimes it might be a page. Galit does the same thing. Her book is all from her office, her couch, her therapist's couch. They're all been her clients. And you might get a couple of pages. And when I was reading Rachel's story in Galit's book, I wanted to know more about Rachel. I resonated with her so much, even though it's quite different, but I still resonated. I wanted to know more of her story, in that I wanted to know how this part in the book fitted with the rest of her life. And so one of the reasons I used my story, and I've written all of this as a memoir, is so that people can have that experience of seeing how this intergenerational legacy plays out in our whole life. It started before I was born. I'm kind of changing the legacy a little bit, but I wanted to kind of use myself as the case study, if you like. But I also wanted people to have the research. I wanted people to know what I'm knowing. And just by the way, what's in Hush is a 15 of what I learned. It's like, might have to be a second book. I don't know. But, and on the back of the bookmarks that I'm actually, that people can find around the place, I've created an opportunity for you to write down as you read Hush, what am I going to read next? And I'd urge people to maybe go onto my website and just shoot me an email and say, this is what I think I need to do. Which one of these should I read first, or what order should I read them in, depending on my situation? I'd love to help that. And I will be adding to that list. I've already got 2 other books and I want to add to the list, which will be a download from my website when I get round to mastering Canva.
Look, I love that. I think it's amazing. And that's what I mean about your generosity of spirit and in sharing the works of other people, not just your book, but how, as I said, you've really encouraged me now to go and read books by other people because around their stories about family trauma, about, the hidden things that most families have in their lives is quite fascinating. I was saying to you right before we started recording that I myself, I found out at the age of 16 that the man I thought was my biological father, who I had, was a very toxic relationship. I found out from my mother at 16 that he wasn't actually my biological father. But in saying that, she then wouldn't give up the identity of the man that was. And it was only, I was on ancestry.com for years before I finally got a match. And I won't go into that now because this is all fairly new in me connecting with people and finding out that who my biological father was, but also that I have siblings and that they're in another country, and that which has been really lovely. And I have connected with 2 of them, and but it's very new, and so in fairness to them, I'm not ready to really go into that and talk about it yet. But I think it's that really fascinating kind of thing that's going on right at the moment. There's a bit of this explosion of this happening around the world because of places like ancestry.com. I know there are a number of sites where you can go on and do your DNA, or you can just do your family tree and not do your DNA. But in doing your DNA, for me it was, I don't know, it was a really interesting kind of feeling of when I sent it off, put it in the mail, and then thought, I don't know, will I ever connect with anyone? Will I ever really find out the secrets? Will I find out who this person is? All of those things, because you just don't know. And then when it happens, then there's new emotions of going, oh, now that I know, did I really want to know? And what does that mean? And what does that mean about my identity? One of the things that I find really fascinating, though, in these stories, because I've met, and I do have really close friends actually who are in the same boat and who have since found biological family, which is extraordinary. just
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
And for them, it's been such a great journey. I'm fascinated, though, about, you write a lot about DNA. Like, there is a theme about DNA in here. And for me, I'm fascinated by the idea of nurture versus nature. Who are we? Where does it really come from? And for
Yes.
me, I always felt completely radically different from my family, from my siblings. The things that I was interested in were very different from the things that they were interested in.
Yeah.
And that growing up, there'd been jokes made in my direction that, oh, you must have been swapped at the hospital, things like that, because I was so different. And
Oh.
so now I'm like, well, was that nature or was it nurture? Because if you're all raised in this, in a similar way up to a certain age, then why was I so radically different? I just find the whole thing really interesting. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that. When you found out your family's identity that had been hidden from you, how that impacted on you and how you thought about yourself.
Mm. And people have wanted to have that conversation with me about the nature versus nurture. And say, oh, it doesn't fit. Well, I kind of do. I totally think it fits. I think it gives us a new perspective to the conversation. It doesn't change. It doesn't mean it's not one or the other. What it means is we need to take in we cannot ignore nature. We cannot ignore our genetic makeup. We simply can't in that conversation. Sandy, I do think a lot of this is kind of coming to the party later in the conversation, that I don't think, really, Mark's book only was published in 2016. I think certainly the family constellation work and a lot of other work with our inner child and so on has been going on for a while. This to me is a very different approach, and it is more the science of an approach where you can do something like have your DNA tested and you can look at the attribute, you can find out, which side of was it your mother or your father that had blue eyes or brown eyes, or liked coriander or, preferred dancing and all of that kind of stuff. You can actually find those things out on ancestry.com, as you probably know, which is the interesting side. But now there are a lot of health professionals who are actually using DNA testing in order to treat people's health issues. And again, epigenetics plays a role in that. So what does this mean within a family? Let's just say you have 3 siblings from the same parents. We can still see the distinction there in how they view the world and how they view the memory of their childhood and the relationships they have with their parents. Because again, well, what might have been at play? Now, I've introduced you to Chris in Hush, and his experience of the very extreme violent physical trauma of his childhood is a very different experience to his brothers, yet they grew up in the same house. It's just a very different memory. Or is it? Or was something else at play? So that's when we go back and the first question we would ask is, what was going on for your mum when she was pregnant with you? And if that experience between the different pregnancies is at play, then suddenly we've got a new ingredient in the recipe of our identity. In my case, I think the trauma that my father experienced up until the point, like really from such a young age, like really from since his birth to when I was conceived. Now, and we know that if you're exposed to those levels of trauma, it can impact and be carried on the sperm, so that when conception is taking place, there's another set of circumstances. With men, with sperm, it can be up to within 24 hours before conception. So that can be different with one sibling to another sibling. So we start to see, maybe science is telling us that things going on within families, the nurturing may be the same, Of course, it may not. I was talking to somebody in the last couple of days who'd read Hush, wanted to share their story about Hush. And it was very much about her birth being very different to the birth that her mother experienced, giving birth to her siblings. It meant that her mother had to stay in hospital and so on and so on. So we're looking at so many things differently that we can't just go nurture anymore. We almost need another word, don't we? Another N word.
We do. It would be good to have another word.
To expand the conversation, which is why I think it expands the identity conversation. I don't think we can ignore what sits below the line, what sits below, like inside our skin. I don't think we can ignore what came forward from previous generations at our point of conception, at our time in vitro, at our time. Actually, Gabor Mate, I think it's he who says the first 9 months of life is like the second gestation for a child, because so much is going on then in the formation of this young newborn baby, prefrontal cortex and so on, that if the mother is distracted or mother and child are separated because of illness or situation or a whole range of things, that there can be impacts on that child that may not happen to another, the next one along. Or there might have been a miscarriage. There might have been indeed a child given away. It's a big conversation for one podcast, Sandy.
It's a very big conversation, but I wanted to touch on it because I think people will be reading your book, and I think you've so beautifully really touched on it in terms of how it impacted you to find out, I have this heritage. And, I think this might be true for a number of people, not all people, but in finding out their background, and I know that you were talking about in the book when people go on ancestry.com and there's all these stories and they go, I thought I was Italian and I've lived my entire life being Italian, embracing my Italian heritage, only to find out, guess what, I'm not Italian, things like that. But how it impacts us to say, well, I thought I was this, and I know all the pieces of me, but now I find out, actually, wait, it's a bit more layered, because in actual fact, I'm also this.
Totally. And I think what's interesting is, so my DNA thinking started when I was watching Insight on SBS. And they had
Great show.
Great show.
And
just by the way, last night it was on Family Secrets.
Oh,
so I'm going to be watching that in the next day or two. But this rise in programs like Who Do You Think You Are? Where Did I Come From? In fact, they have one called Family Secrets where they go and dig up, generally they're celebrities, aren't they? But it doesn't matter. Everyone's families, everyone's, it's the same. It's interesting, isn't it? Why do you think we have such a hunger for these kind of programs, or reading these kind of books, or Danny Shapiro's memoir Inheritance, that opens with her doing a DNA test. Her and a partner just thought they'd do a DNA test, and look what that revealed.
Yeah.
A very good memoir and podcasts. So I'm really interested in why we are so interested in this now at this particular time. I mean, I've got some theories, but yeah, don't you think it's interesting that maybe it's because the more people who get onto ancestry.com and the more, I don't know, I've been there since 2018, and there's been no other revelation. I still haven't been able to find anything about my father's family other than I can't remember. I've found nothing. Still know nothing about my grandfather Ludwig's family, other than they were clearly Jewish.
Yeah.
Right? I've got his baptism certificate that says he was Lutheran. It's fascinating.
So fascinating.
time.
And yeah, and I agree with you, but I do think maybe the rise of it is because the technology's there now, and it's very easy to do a DNA test now, whereas years ago it would have been difficult and expensive and complicated. Now it's quite easy to do it. You know, like anyone who hasn't done it, I will say ancestry.com, you know, they send you like basically a tube, and it's you put your saliva in the tube, you spit in it, and you seal it up and you send it on back, and it's quite extraordinary. And I think the most fascinating for me was seeing that they can actually identify the paternal side and the maternal side of your DNA makeup. That was really fascinating to me.
Isn't it though? Isn't it? When you see it written down percentage against. Again, this is all part of the recipe. That, you know, in my work, when I'm talking to people about personal brand strategy, which is all about how do you stand out, which people seem to forget. They just think it's about social media and TikTok. But it's all about standing out. In my world, it's about business, attracting business, or, you know, for a long time it was career management and leadership development and so on. And the number of people who would sit in front of me and say, well, I just do my job. You know, I do it like that's my job. And I have those competencies, and that's what I do because that's my job. There's nothing else special about me. How can I do anything with a personal brand? Because that's just who I am. I mean, this is who I am. What you see is what you get. Let me propose that what you see is actually a little bit deeper. So I encourage people now when I'm working with them and we're talking about, because you've got a personal brand whether you like it or not, but just when we try and work out, well, what is really different about you? You know, how are you going to stand out? What story are you going to tell to bring people into your aura? Now we go a little bit deeper than we might have done in the past. That's where our special recipe, that's where our gold is. That's where we can start finding out not just the facts of the story, but from that story, how did that impact us? Like, why am I attracted to teaching, counselling, coaching, mentoring, nurturing women in business? Where did that come from? I had a loving mother, but I wasn't especially nurtured in the way that it wasn't textbook. She was too distracted. No fault of her own. She was just too distracted. Able to nurture other people and other family members later on, but why am I attracted to those? That way of working. Interesting.
It is interesting.
I understand it now.
Yeah, which is
great.
We
do see a lot of people in those professions that require a lot of empathy and compassion. Nursing, any of those helping professions. We'll kind of see maybe where some of this became an attribute of that individual. It's not a surprise.
Yeah, I often think about that myself. And I think, interesting relationship that I had with my mum. And again, she did the very best she could do with the tools that she had. I mean, this is a reality for a lot of women of her generation. And I think, it's no surprise that I would then go on to be a born nurturer and who loves to nurture people in a way that perhaps I wasn't. And so I recognised that in your book. And I think that was really another lovely parallel. But I went, I can see myself a little bit there. We were talking a little bit about this earlier, but I wanted to ask you this question, that exactly that your story will resonate with so many people. And even though our stories may not be identical and other people may never have experienced what your family has experienced, they will find things in there, I'm sure, that will resonate if they in fact have any kind of secrets, that they discover in the family. How has you telling your story with such bravery and such honesty changed your worldview or changed the way that people perhaps interact with you?
Look, I think it's changed, I'm going to say dramatically, and that's kind of based on the feedback I've had from people. One of the girls I was at school with came to my launch. Haven't seen her in decades.
Wow.
We were in the same kind of group in years 11 and 12. And she was just kind of fascinated with where all this had landed. Because when I was at school, I was just kind of there, a bit on the outer. I wasn't good at anything especially. That's not true. I was good, I wasn't excellent. Because I only ever did enough. I worked that out early. I didn't ever push myself. But I think, again, that was probably because I needed to remain a bit mediocre and a bit hidden. So it was, anyway. And she's kind of like, oh gosh, to see you now. And so people who I've spoken to that haven't seen me, another friend said it's kind of, you now match, the energy or the experience of you now is more congruent than it was before. Because remember we talked earlier about, I've always played with a bit of colour and I wanted to be a fashion designer, so I've always had an interest in wardrobe and fashion. And so it's a bit odd, isn't it? I was prepared to kind of dress in a way that might draw attention. And I say that, I don't say that with any, I wasn't intentionally doing that. I just liked bright colours, maybe because it was a very dark house that I grew up in, not a lot of colour. But now I think I've allowed my generous energy to come forward because I don't have to hide. Here's the thing, when you don't have to hide anything because it's in the book, you show up as a very different person. And I don't need to suppress anything anymore. I'm quite happy to say, well, this is who I am. Yeah. And I'm able to do this because this is my story. Without this story, I wouldn't be here doing this. I wouldn't be talking to you, Sandy. I wouldn't have, ironically, been working in personal brand for 20 years. Like, goodness me, fancy doing that. So there's some irony there, and the joy. I'm on a mission now. I'm on an unhushing mission. I'm on a mission to help people have the same aha moments, the same, surface the bits of their story that they need to in order to resolve. This is what I learned, without resolution of all of those bits, there is no healing. Or it's, you can't go straight to healing in these situations, which is why all of those years and years and years and years of counselling and trying Reiki and trying everything. I tried everything and still would spend weekends in the house, not speaking to anybody, not going anywhere. And then come Monday, I'd put it all on again and off I'd go.
Yeah.
So there was no healing. There was just, I learned a lot of techniques, but I didn't heal.
Yeah.
And I talk about it now. Is that heart, mind and body. We need to heal those 3 levels in order to be fully enough, in order to really turn up and show up and be in service to others and really get out there with our vision and our mission, unhush, or whatever it is that you need to do. You're unhushing too, though. See?
Oh, 100%. I'm completely unhushing.
That's right.
I am unhushing. And I think that, I said this to you before we hit record today, but part of my absolute passion, just like yourself, I guess, is really allowing people to be able to share and tell their stories, because in the telling of those stories, it's so powerful. The one thing I've learned is the more women that I speak to and the more people that come on here and share their extraordinary stories, it really does give permission for other people to then share theirs. Or at the very least, someone will be listening to your story today and think, oh, I thought I was alone. I honestly thought I was the only one. And they will discover that they're not alone, that there is always someone else who may not have the identical story, might have different things going on within their story, but will have elements of the story that resonate with them because they feel like they're alone and they discover they're not. I think it's so powerful.
150,000% agree with you. And I think it's that it started with me after Chris died, was that thing about, you know, when you're grieving and you've had all the stuff that's gone on and there's been a funeral and there's been this and this and this, and then time goes on and people go back to their lives and we're expected to go back to our lives, and I wasn't. It was because I hadn't addressed any of this previously in the way I needed to. His death was the final thing that just went boom, and all these layers of grief just went bang out of my head and just spilt into my life. And at those dark times in the middle of the night when I was on my own, not able to sleep, going over and over and over and over everything in my head, I would just think, I just wish you people out there, I just wish you could walk in my shoes for one day and know what it's like. Now, I don't expect people to walk in my shoes, but I reckon Hush resonates with people walking in their own shoes. We may have swapped shoes for a day or two somewhere through our lives, but we resonate, we know, and it's okay for you to feel that, and it's okay for you to find that, to talk about it, to share it, and to be validated in doing that. It is okay. In fact, it's really, really healthy.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's beautiful. Before I let you go today, Michelle, the one thing I did want to ask you about, other than Hush, was how you've done this amazing TED Talk. I want to know, how did that come about, and how did you feel when you got on that stage? Because I imagine, I mean, you know, a TED Talk is huge. This is no small thing to do, to bring yourself fully to a stage. And then how did you feel when you did it?
So it came about through a women's business network that I was in. And one of the things, we'd been away on a retreat to, this is pre-COVID, just before COVID, to work on our speaking kits and our speaking content and all the rest of it. I did not have TED Talk on my vision board, for metaphorically, at all at that time. And it came up as if we're going to be on platforms, stages speaking, ultimately, TED Talks. Yeah, sure. Then COVID hit, and in fact, we didn't get away physically on the retreat until one of the breaks in lockdown. And by then I had started some of this work, and I was talking about it to a couple of the women in the group. And so it was kind of out there in a sense. And then it was some time later, a year later or so on. In fact, the person who had facilitated that group she had the contact, a bit more high profile. So she had the contact and did her talk. And it was then I started to think, maybe, because again, I just thought I was a very regular, normal person that didn't have anything to say. But but once I'd started doing all of this and kind of worked out, I think I actually do have something to say, because again, I wasn't hearing anybody else say this. So yes, I'd discovered Mark's work and I'd started reading these other books, not all of them, but some of them. But I hadn't heard anybody say what I wanted to say in relation to identity. Then one day I got the call, Michelle. No, I didn't get the call. I got a message.
I was going to say, you
What's
got a
that
text?
Message? A text. I got a text. Got a text. Is it time? And I immediately, my immediate reaction was absolutely not. But before I replied, I just sat with it for a while and thought, yeah, I think it is time. Because I'd started working on the first manuscript by that stage. It wasn't a memoir. It was just trying to pull it all together and join the dots in a way, in a manuscript form. And then I think the thing is that the one thing about it is the more time, and I was a little bit resistant to this, I have to say. I'm a bit of an ad-libber, but I knew that I had to submit a script, so I had to write it. And I had to rewrite it and edit it and practice it. And in doing that, I was able to take the emotion. Like when you hear your own words out loud over and over, you know what's coming. And so it helps you settle with the emotion because it's not the first time you've heard it. So by the time I was actually giving that talk, I'd heard it many, many times, and I knew what was coming. And the more I massaged the language, the richer the storytelling element of that became. I learned a lot, by the way, just in that process. And the more committed I felt to tell it. So I was pretty buzzed by the time it was done. But I still, this is really funny because I still thought, oh, how am I going to watch this? When it's up on YouTube, how am I actually going to watch it? And I still have to have the sound off for the opening remarks.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I can read them, but I can't hear myself say them. Not in there. But I watched it and thought, hang on, I don't need to be embarrassed. It's okay. It is okay. I'm kind of happy with that.
I think you should be more than happy with it. I think, you're an extraordinary person. Your ability to tell your story is extraordinary. And I always say that when people share of themselves, especially in the way that you have with a memoir, it takes extraordinary courage. I do believe that because you really, as you say, it's all out there now. You put yourself out into the world, but in some ways, I'm glad you said that for you it was freeing as well, and that you're able to just now turn up as an entire fully formed entity, which is so beautiful.
And that's absolutely what it is. Absolutely what it is. And, like it isn't, somebody asked at the book launch, but you still get lonely, or when you wake up in the middle of the night, do you still feel any of that grief? Yeah, of course I do. But I know what it is now.
Yeah.
I totally understand it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the power that it did. It is known, not unknown. I can have a conversation now. I can talk to Grant. That those rituals of honouring Grant, honouring my grandparents and my parents, that was a healing in itself. Just being able to have them in photo frames, because that's the best I can do, and have them together and see them every day. I couldn't I just didn't have any photos of prior, because it just was like in the past, and it just wasn't resonating. It just wasn't. But now, and if you've read Hush, you know the story of the photos of Grant. So to be able to have that photo there that I now have and I treasure. So the healing doesn't happen overnight, but again, the resolution enables you to take steps toward that, and it becomes easier. It becomes integrated. You know, we become a more integrated person than we ever were. That's when we do our best work. That's when we become our best, to coin a phrase, best version of ourselves.
I love that. And I think it's such that is a beautiful way to end this lovely podcast. I could talk to you for hours, I think. I want to say a huge, huge thank you. Thank you for sharing your story, your truth, your honesty. Thank you for sharing what I like to call hard-won wisdom, which women have. Thank you. And I encourage everyone to go out, buy Hush, read Hush, get your hands on it. It is a truly amazing story that deals with a lot of themes, mostly about, unraveling the secrets that happen in families, and how we deal with it in our identity, as you say, is this story really is about finding your identity. And I think it's going to help a lot of other people to help find theirs as well, which is really beautiful. Big thank you. In our show notes, I will, of course, put all the links to where people can find your book, find your website, find all of your recommendations. And I love that when you read the book, as Michelle has said, definitely jump online, email Michelle and tell her what other books you've been reading and your thoughts about the books that she has recommended.
And tell me a story.
Yeah.
What I'm working toward is welcoming Hush ambassadors and welcoming their stories. And so rather than a blog on my website, there will be, it will be a blog, but it will be other people's stories.
I love that.
And it won't be all of them, because some of them won't, some will want to be anonymous or whatever the case may be. But I've had one story already, and they will be housed there. So it will be an opportunity for people to tell their stories and for other people to come and read them. So you'll have the podcast, I'll have the stories there.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Yeah.
So that's what I'm working toward.
It's about really, what you're doing is building a community of people to never feel alone again, right? It's to understand that there are people out there who have different experiences, but similar stories, or different stories altogether, but elements that definitely resonate. And I think that's such a beautiful thing to do. Community is amazing. You are amazing, Michelle, if I say.
Thank you, Sandy. You're very amazing to be creating this platform. And can I say, your generosity in listening and the questions that you ask makes this so much easier for the person up on the other side of the microphone. So thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Time's gone really quickly.
It has. It's just flown. Thank you. I feel very honoured. I think you're amazing. As I said, all of the links are going to be in the show notes, and we'll make sure that we share those links across our socials as well, so that everyone can find you, Michelle. And as I said, I think that what you've done is extraordinary. The story is extraordinary, but it's more than just a story. It is a journey of healing and self-discovery and identity. And I think that in itself is so powerful. I thank you. Thank you for your incredible time today.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I loved every minute of it. Thank you.
Me too.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine. Available now at WB40.com. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.